That glass didn't slip from my hand by accident. It saved a billionaire's life. The dinner rush had settled into that comfortable rhythm every restaurant worker knows. Soft conversations drifted beneath the warm glow of hanging lights. Silverware clinked against expensive plates. Outside, the last traces of sunset reflected across the glass windows of the Hawthorne Grill, one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants. I was carrying a tray of sparkling water toward table 12 when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. 5 men entered within less than 30 seconds of each other. Most people wouldn't have noticed. They arrived separately. They wore different clothes, different expressions, different watches worth more than my monthly paycheck. But they moved like they already knew where everyone would be, like they had rehearsed something. I lowered the tray carefully and continued walking. My name is Claire Whitmore. I was 41 years old, a waitress working double shifts to cover rent on a small apartment 10 miles outside downtown. At least that was what everyone believed. Across the dining room sat Ethan Callaway, one of the most recognizable CEOs in America. 52 years old, founder of a technology empire worth billions. Tonight, he was having dinner with 2 potential investors. He looked relaxed, calm, completely unaware that every instinct in my body was suddenly awake. One of the men stopped near the entrance and glanced toward Ethan's table. Another positioned himself near the bar. A third sat alone with an untouched drink. The remaining 2 spread out across opposite sides of the room. I kept moving, forcing myself to smile at customers. "Can I get you anything else tonight?" I asked a couple celebrating an anniversary. They smiled. I smiled back. But my attention never left those 5 men. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The air felt different. Heavy. Like the moment before a thunderstorm arrives. Ethan laughed at something one of the investors said. He reached for his glass. Completely relaxed. Completely exposed. Then I saw the signal. It was small. So small that nobody else in the restaurant would have noticed. One man adjusted the cuff of his jacket. Another nodded once. The third looked toward the front door. My pulse quickened. The tray suddenly felt heavier in my hands. I took one more step and deliberately let a water glass fall. The sharp sound echoed across the dining room. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. Ethan looked up. The 5 men froze for just a fraction of a second. And in that brief moment, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was about to happen next had already begun. For most people, the sound of breaking glass was nothing more than an interruption, an inconvenience, something a waitress would apologize for before quickly cleaning up the mess. But as I knelt beside the shattered pieces, I watched the room through their reflections. The 5 men had reacted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice. Yet it was there, a hesitation, a disruption in whatever silent timing they had been following. One of them glanced toward another. Another shifted his weight and looked away. Tiny movements, but movements that did not belong in an ordinary dinner crowd. "Are you all right?" Ethan called from his table. His voice carried easily across the restaurant. Calm, polite, completely unaware of how much attention had just shifted toward him. I looked up and forced a smile. "Just a clumsy moment," I said. A few customers laughed softly. The atmosphere began settling again. Conversations slowly returned. Chairs scraped against polished hardwood floors. Waiters resumed moving between tables. To everyone else, the interruption was over. To me, it had only confirmed what I already feared. The men were not here for dinner. I carried the broken glass toward the service station near the kitchen entrance. The bright fluorescent lights behind the swinging doors felt harsh compared to the warm glow of the dining room. My manager, Denise, frowned when she saw me. "Everything okay out there?" she asked. "Busy night." "Very busy," I replied quietly. She gave me a puzzled look, but quickly returned to reviewing receipts. I stepped toward the small window overlooking the dining area. Ethan was back in conversation with his guests. One investor leaned forward, enthusiastically, gesturing as he spoke. The other nodded while reviewing documents. It looked like any high-level business dinner. Yet the 5 strangers remained exactly where they had positioned themselves. One near the entrance, one near the bar, one seated alone, 2 others maintaining clear views of Ethan's table. Too perfect, too deliberate. Then something else caught my attention. The man nearest the bar never once touched the expensive bourbon sitting in front of him. Not a sip, not even once. People order drinks because they want them. People pretending to belong order drinks because they need a reason to stay. A chill crept down my spine. Outside the large front windows, the city lights reflected against the dark evening sky. Traffic flowed normally. Pedestrians walked past without a second glance toward the restaurant. Everything beyond these walls looked completely ordinary. Inside, however, tension was building like pressure beneath a sealed lid. I took a slow breath. Years ago, I would have trusted someone else to handle what came next. Years ago, I had worn a different uniform and answered to different responsibilities. But those years were supposed to be behind me now. I glanced back toward Ethan's table. At that exact moment, one of the 5 men subtly adjusted his wristwatch and another immediately stood from his chair. No words were exchanged. No obvious signal was given. Yet both actions were connected. And suddenly I realized something that made my heartbeat quicken. They were no longer waiting for the right opportunity. They believed the opportunity had finally arrived. I remained by the service station, pretending to organize menus while watching the dining room through the corner of my eye. The man who had just stood up adjusted his jacket and began walking slowly between tables. Not toward the exit, not toward the restrooms, toward Ethan. Every instinct inside me told me this was not random. The strange part was how ordinary everything looked. A couple near the window was celebrating an anniversary. A family of 4 was sharing dessert. Soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers overhead. The scent of grilled steak and fresh bread filled the air. Anyone walking into the restaurant would have thought it was a perfect evening. Yet beneath that calm surface, something was unfolding. Ethan leaned back in his chair and smiled at one of the investors. He seemed completely focused on business. He had no reason to think otherwise. People like him spent their lives attending dinners, meetings, and negotiations. Success created routines. Routines created blind spots. The 5 men understood that. That was what worried me most. This had not been planned for days. It felt planned for weeks. Maybe longer. I carried a fresh pitcher of water into the dining room and moved toward table 12. As I passed Ethan's table, I noticed something else. One of the investors looked nervous. Not terrified, just distracted. He kept checking his phone beneath the table. Every few minutes. His smile seemed forced. His answers came a second too late. Ethan either did not notice or chose to ignore it. I slowed my pace. The investor suddenly looked up and briefly locked eyes with one of the 5 men. The contact lasted less than a second. Most people would have missed it. I did not. My pulse quickened. That was not the look of strangers. It was the look of people confirming a plan. I continued walking and refilled glasses at a nearby table. My hands appeared steady. Inside, my mind was racing. Years ago, I had learned that the most dangerous situations rarely announced themselves. They hid inside normal moments. Inside ordinary conversations. Behind friendly smiles. The man near the entrance checked his watch again. The one by the bar quietly stood. Another moved closer to Ethan's side of the room. The distance between them was shrinking. Not enough to attract attention. Just enough to create pressure. A trap closing one step at a time. Then Ethan's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen. His expression changed. Only slightly. The confident smile disappeared. His eyes narrowed. He read the message twice. For the first time that evening, he looked unsettled. Very unsettled. Slowly, he raised his head and scanned the restaurant. And when his gaze reached the 5 men scattered across the room, I realized something important. He finally knew they were there. But judging from the look on his face, he knew something else as well. The change in Ethan's expression lasted only a moment, but it was enough. Whatever message had appeared on his phone was not ordinary. He set the device face down on the table and forced a smile for his investors. Yet the confidence that had filled his posture earlier was gone. I watched him carefully while carrying a tray of coffee toward another section of the dining room. He was thinking now, calculating, looking for answers. Unfortunately, the 5 men were doing the same thing. The man nearest the entrance casually adjusted his position. Another moved closer to the hallway leading toward the private dining rooms. None of them appeared rushed. That was what made them dangerous. They believed they controlled the pace of the evening. They believed nobody saw the pattern. Nobody except me. I stopped near the kitchen doors and glanced toward the large mirror mounted behind the bar. Reflections revealed things people often missed. Through the glass, I could see almost every corner of the restaurant at once. 5 men. Ethan, the nervous investor. And suddenly one more detail appeared. The investor slipped his phone beneath the table and received a message. Seconds later, the man near the entrance checked his own phone. My stomach tightened. They were communicating. Quietly. Efficiently. Without speaking a word. Ethan must have noticed something similar, because he leaned back and scanned the room again. This time his eyes paused on each man individually. Recognition flashed across his face. Not recognition of names perhaps, but recognition of a threat. Then something happened that surprised me. Instead of leaving, Ethan remained seated. He folded his hands calmly and continued the meeting. For a brief moment, I almost smiled. Billionaires did not reach the top by panicking. Whatever message he had received, he had decided to stay. That meant he either believed help was coming, or he had a plan of his own. Neither possibility made me feel any better. The pressure inside the room continued building. Outside, night had fully settled over. The city. Headlights drifted across the windows like moving stars. Inside, the warm restaurant lighting created long reflections across polished floors and dark wood tables. Customers continued eating, laughing, celebrating birthdays and anniversaries, completely unaware that several lives were slowly moving toward the same collision point. Denise walked past me carrying menus. "Claire, table 14, needs another bottle of wine." I nodded automatically. Right away. My voice sounded calm. Years of practice helped with that. You learn to hide tension when people depend on you to remain steady. As I reached for the wine bottle, my eyes drifted toward one of the 5 men again. This time I noticed something I had missed before. A small silver pin attached to his jacket. Most people would have ignored it. I did not, because I had seen that symbol once before, years ago, in a part of my life I had spent a long time trying to forget. And the moment I recognized it, I realized this situation was far bigger than a business dispute. The sight of that small silver pin pulled me backward through time so quickly that for a moment the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade. I had not seen that symbol in nearly 12 years. Most people would have mistaken it for an ordinary piece of metal, a decorative accessory, something meaningless. It was not meaningless. It belonged to a private network of corporate intelligence contractors who specialized in gathering information, influencing negotiations, and controlling outcomes before anyone realized a game was being played. Years ago, I had crossed paths with them during a chapter of my life that very few people knew existed. Back then, I learned one simple lesson. Whenever that symbol appeared, there was always a larger story hidden beneath the surface. I placed the wine bottle on a tray and forced myself to continue working. Customers needed refills. Orders needed to be delivered. The restaurant expected a waitress. Nothing more. Nothing less. That was exactly why nobody paid attention to me. And tonight, that invisibility might become my greatest advantage. Across the room, Ethan appeared calm again, but now I recognized the signs. He was no longer engaged in casual business conversation. He was studying the room while pretending not to. His investors noticed the change as well. The nervous one seemed increasingly uncomfortable. He checked his phone twice within a minute. His fingers trembled slightly each time. Whatever was happening, he knew more than he wanted to admit. I walked past their table carrying a basket of fresh bread. As I approached, I caught part of Ethan's conversation. "Interesting timing," he said quietly. The investor forced a laugh. "I'm not sure what you mean." Ethan smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "I think you do." The investor immediately looked away. That single exchange told me everything I needed to know. Ethan was connecting the pieces. Slowly, carefully, the same way I was. The difference was that he still did not know who was orchestrating the situation. Then the front door opened. A gust of cool night air drifted through the restaurant. Every one of the 5 men looked up at exactly the same moment. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice. But I noticed. Their attention had shifted toward the newcomer. A tall man in an expensive charcoal coat stepped inside and removed his gloves. He was in his late 50s. White hair, confident posture. The kind of confidence that comes from believing the room already belongs to you. He did not rush. He did not speak. Yet the moment he entered, the entire atmosphere changed. Ethan saw him too. For the first time all evening, genuine concern crossed his face. The newcomer smiled slightly and began walking toward the center of the restaurant. And when I saw Ethan's reaction, I realized something unsettling. This was the person he had been worried about all along. The man in the charcoal coat moved through the restaurant as if he owned every square foot of it. Customers barely noticed him. Why would they? He looked like another successful executive arriving late for dinner. But the 5 men scattered around the room noticed him immediately. Their attention followed him with quiet discipline. The nervous investor noticed him too. In fact, the moment the newcomer entered, all color seemed to drain from the investor's face. Ethan remained seated, yet his shoulders stiffened slightly. That tiny change told me more than any conversation could have. These two men shared a history, not a pleasant one. The newcomer stopped beside Ethan's table and smiled. It was the kind of smile that looked friendly from across the room, but carried no warmth up close. One of the investors immediately excused himself and stood. The other pretended to check his phone. Neither wanted to be caught in whatever conversation was about to happen. I continued serving nearby tables while listening carefully. Years of working in restaurants had taught me how to hear things without appearing to listen. "It has been a long time, Ethan," the newcomer said. His voice was smooth and controlled. Ethan nodded once. "Not long enough." The smile on the man's face widened slightly. Around them, dinner service continued. Plates arrived. Glasses clinked. A birthday group near the back of the restaurant applauded as a dessert was delivered with candles. The contrast felt surreal. Ordinary life continued only a few feet away from something much larger. The newcomer slowly sat down without being invited. He adjusted his coat and glanced around the dining room. His eyes briefly passed over each of the 5 men. No words were exchanged, yet the message was obvious. They were all connected. My pulse quickened. The pieces were finally beginning to fit together. Ethan folded his hands. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. The man chuckled. "That is not the right question." His gaze shifted toward the investors. "The right question is whether everyone at this table knows the same version of the truth." Silence followed. Heavy silence. Even from 20 feet away, I could feel the tension spreading. The nervous investor looked down at the table. He could not maintain eye contact with anyone. That alone told me he was hiding something important. Then the newcomer reached into his coat and placed a sealed envelope on the table. No threats, no raised voices, just an envelope. Yet Ethan stared at it, as if it contained something dangerous, something powerful. The newcomer leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice. I could not hear the next sentence, but whatever he said caused Ethan's expression to change immediately. And for the first time all evening, Ethan looked genuinely shocked. For a few seconds, Ethan did not respond. He simply stared at the envelope resting on the white tablecloth. The conversations around the restaurant continued, but they felt distant now, as if the entire room had shifted behind a layer of glass. The newcomer leaned back comfortably and folded his hands. He was not worried. In fact, he looked almost amused. That alone made me uneasy. People become dangerous when they are completely certain of the outcome. Ethan finally reached for the envelope. His movements were slow and deliberate. He opened it carefully and removed several documents. The moment his eyes scanned the first page, I saw something change. Not fear, not panic, recognition. The kind that comes when a hidden problem suddenly steps into the light. Across the table, the nervous investor lowered his head. He already knew what was inside. I would have bet my entire paycheck on it. The other investor looked confused, glancing between the documents and the newcomer. Whatever was happening, not everyone had been told the same story. I moved toward a nearby table carrying a coffee pot, using the routine of restaurant service as cover. Years ago, I learned that people rarely notice someone refilling cups. They speak freely. They reveal things. They assume nobody is listening. Ethan turned another page. Then another. His jaw tightened. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. The newcomer smiled. "That is not important." "It is very important." The response came immediately. Sharp. Controlled. The first real emotion Ethan had shown all night. The newcomer tapped one finger against the table. "The important part is that your board of directors would find those documents fascinating." My pulse quickened. Board of directors. Corporate leverage. Suddenly, the entire picture became clearer. This was not a random confrontation. This was a calculated attempt to pressure Ethan using information. The 5 men scattered throughout the restaurant were not there to create chaos. They were there to create certainty, witnesses, pressure, presence, a silent reminder that Ethan was surrounded. The realization made everything more dangerous than I originally thought. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan looked up and smiled. A genuine smile. Small, calm, confident. The newcomer's expression changed slightly. Just slightly. "You seem surprised," Ethan said. "I think you expected a different reaction." Silence followed. The newcomer studied him carefully. Around them, Customers continued eating desserts and discussing weekend plans, completely unaware of the battle unfolding a few feet away. Ethan placed the documents back inside the envelope and slid it across the table. "You spent a great deal of effort arranging tonight," he said. "Unfortunately, you made one mistake." The newcomer narrowed his eyes. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on his face. Ethan glanced across the dining room. Not at the 5 men. Not at the investors. His gaze landed directly on me. And in that instant, I realized he knew exactly who I was. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. Ethan's eyes remained fixed on me across the dining room. Not a casual glance. Not the look of a customer recognizing a waitress. Recognition. Real recognition. The newcomer noticed it immediately. His smile faded as he followed Ethan's line of sight. Suddenly, I was no longer invisible. The realization sent a wave of tension through me. For years, I had built a quiet life. A small apartment. Long shifts. Predictable routines. I had worked very hard to become ordinary. Yet one look from Ethan threatened to pull an entire past back into the light. The newcomer slowly turned in his chair. His gaze settled on me. Calculating. Curious. He was trying to understand what Ethan had just seen. More importantly, he was trying to understand why it mattered. Ethan leaned back and folded his arms. The confidence had returned to his voice. "You investigated my company," he said calmly. "You monitored my meetings. You pressured people around me. You even arranged tonight." The newcomer said nothing. Ethan smiled slightly. "But you never investigated the staff." A long silence followed. The meaning landed. Instantly, the newcomer looked toward me again. This time his expression was different. Not confidence. Concern. Small, controlled concern. I picked up an empty tray and continued working because that was the safest thing I could do. The fewer people noticed me, the better. Unfortunately, that option was disappearing quickly. One of the 5 men near the bar quietly adjusted his position. Another checked his phone. The coordinated certainty I had observed all evening was beginning to crack. Questions were replacing confidence. Across the table, the nervous investor finally spoke. "Who is she?" The question hung in the air. Ethan looked directly at him. "That is the interesting part," he replied. "You tell me." The investor looked confused. The newcomer looked irritated. Neither had an answer. That told me something important. They knew far less about me than I feared. Years ago, that fact might not have mattered. Tonight, it mattered a great deal. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the restaurant windows. The reflections of city lights blurred across the glass. Inside, dinner service continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Customers sensed something unusual, even if they could not explain it. Conversations had grown quieter. People glanced occasionally toward Ethan's table. Curiosity was spreading. Then the front door opened once more. A woman in a dark business suit entered carrying a leather portfolio. She scanned the room and immediately walked toward Ethan. The newcomer's face tightened the moment he saw her. Ethan stood and greeted her with a handshake. "Perfect timing," he said. The woman placed the portfolio on the table and looked directly at the newcomer. "I believe everyone should hear the full story," she said. And judging by the sudden change in expression on several faces around that table, the full story was about to change everything. The restaurant had become unusually quiet. Not silent, but quieter than before. The kind of quiet that happens when people sense something important is unfolding even if they do not know exactly what it is. The woman in the dark suit opened her portfolio and carefully removed several documents. She placed them on the table beside the envelope. The newcomer's confidence began to fade. For the first time all evening, he looked uncertain. Ethan remained calm. Completely calm. "Go ahead," he said. The woman nodded. Over the last 6 months, someone attempted to influence multiple business negotiations involving Callaway Technologies. False information was distributed. Meetings were monitored. Financial pressure was applied through third parties. The nervous investor lowered his head. The other investor stared in disbelief. The woman continued. "We completed our investigation 3 weeks ago." She slid a document across the table. Everything was documented. The newcomer looked down at the papers. His jaw tightened. Around the restaurant, nobody understood the details, but everyone could feel the shift. The balance of power had changed. Ethan folded his hands. "You believed I would walk into this room unprepared," he said quietly. "You believed I would react emotionally." The newcomer said nothing. Ethan smiled. "That was your mistake." The woman opened another file. There is one more thing. Her eyes moved across the table before settling on me. Every muscle in my body tightened. For a second, I considered walking away, leaving through the kitchen, returning to the life I had spent years building. But it was already too late. Ethan stood and turned toward me. "Claire Whitmore," he said. Several people nearby looked in my direction. Or at least that is the name she uses now. A murmur spread through the room. The woman smiled warmly. Many years ago, Claire helped expose one of the largest corporate fraud operations in federal history. My heart sank. The past I had buried was no longer buried. Yet something surprising happened. Nobody looked at me with fear. Nobody looked at me with suspicion. They looked at me with respect. Ethan nodded. When I saw her tonight, I knew two things. First, she recognized what was happening long before anyone else. Second, if Claire remained calm, then panic was unnecessary. The newcomer stared at me in disbelief. He had spent months studying executives, investors, and board members. He never thought to investigate a waitress. That oversight had changed everything. An hour later, the restaurant slowly returned to normal. Customers finished their meals. Rain continued falling outside. The 5 men left quietly. The investors departed. The newcomer walked out without another word. When the last of them were gone, Ethan approached me near the service station. "You never said a word," he said. I smiled. "Neither did you." For the first time that night, he laughed. Then he handed me a business card. "If you ever decide you want a different job, call me." I looked down at the card, then back at him. My ordinary life suddenly felt a little less ordinary. And as I watched the city lights reflecting through the rain-covered windows, I realized that one unexpected evening had changed both of our futures forever.